And we still don't have a plan to fund the government. I know if some of my Republican colleagues had their way, we'd pass their continuing resolution that contains mindless, across-the-board spending cuts. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to cut funding for cancer research, for Head Start programs, for air traffic safety, for border security, and a 65% cut to heating assistance for families just as it's starting to get cold. Talk about cruel. Their appropriation agenda cuts all this and more. But you know where Republicans refuse to cut from? This bill, the Pentagon, the biggest, most expensive bureaucracy in our federal government, the Department of Defense. So for whatever reason, it's okay to cut programs like WIC that help feed pregnant moms, but they can't find a single weapon system where there's any waste? I mean, and I'm happy to provide numerous articles and reports from my colleagues about the cost overruns in so many of these wasteful missile systems. The defense spending bill, which is the most extravagant defense spending bill ever, failed a rule vote on Tuesday because the Republican conference is in absolute chaos. Best I can tell, no one on the other side of the aisle has any objection to the top-line number in the Pentagon bill, but yet they voted down the rule just the other day. I know that whipping votes can be difficult, but the number of backroom secret deals and late-night seances Republicans have had to hold this year to revive bills from the dead is astounding. And I'm afraid things will only get worse as we near September 30th. Republicans are acting like the end of the fiscal year just snuck up on them. Newsflash, the deadline to fund the government isn't some big secret. They've had months to prevent a government shutdown. But the reality is that not once have Republicans given us a bill that can keep the government open. Republicans barely control one half of one branch of government. And yet, they act like they're king of the hill, like it's their way or the highway, that nothing else matters. The only way this slim House Republican majority can keep the lights on is if they get Senate Democrats and the President to agree. But they haven't even begun to reach across the aisle to negotiate because they're busy negotiating amongst themselves. Hell, at this rate, they might not even be able to get Senate Republicans to agree, given how extreme their conference has become. Madam Speaker, this majority is a failure. The clowns are running the circus. The day Speaker McCarthy handed his gavel over to the clown show, this was the inevitable outcome. But there is a different path that we can choose right here and right now. Work with Democrats to prevent a shutdown. Work with us to keep the government open. Work with us to honor the deal you made earlier this year. It is time for the ringmaster of this circus, Kevin McCarthy, to stand up to the clowns and say, enough with the extremism and the blackmail. Stop wasting time and work with us to get this done in a bipartisan way.
Disagree here. Look, defense is a very different thing than any other part of the appropriations process. Most of the appropriation process is about things that are desirable and good. I've worked pretty hard on cancer research, so my friend's points are well made there. I think those are valuable investments. Defense is about threats. We had a peace dividend in the 1990s. You know why we had it? Because the Soviet Union had collapsed, and we could prudently save money in defense. I would tell you right now, I would go higher than the number here. But if the number we have on defense is outrageous, your first call ought to be to the White House, because it's basically the president's number. We actually pulled back from where our defense appropriators wanted to go, and a lot of our defense hawks wanted to go, because we did think addressing budget, the horrific deficits that were inherited from the last Democratic era meant even here we had to make sacrifices. But I'm not really comfortable with it, but it's a step in the right direction. And we might not even have to have that if you hadn't, through reckless spending, unleashed the worst inflation in 40 years. I actually have a 40-year-old son. He'd never seen anything like what happened in the Biden administration because of the passing irresponsibly of $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, another $700 billion much misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. So, we inherited a mess. We inherited your inflation. We inherited record deficits. Pretty tough deal. And my friends don't want to address them. Well, this majority is going to do its best to address those issues. And we do struggle and disagree. And sometimes I get frustrated with some of my friends on my side of the aisle about tactics they presume. You're right about one thing, and I will agree with you 100%. There is no objection to this rule on the basis of the rule. There's nothing wrong with this. 184 amendments. You can agree or disagree with the bill, but it's a good rule. There's, in my view, nothing wrong with the bill other than I would like to have spent a little bit more money, or like any bill that spends this amount of money, everybody could do it a little bit differently. People are trying to make other points unrelated to the bill. I will agree with my friend. That's unfortunate. I don't think that's a good way to legislate. I think you should look at the legislation in front of you. If you agree with the rule, you ought to vote for it. You should, if you disagree, fair enough to vote against it. But if you agree with the basic bill, you don't relate it to something else and try and use it as a weapon. And we don't have many members that do that. We have a few. And as my friend knows, we have a very narrow majority. You've been here once or twice yourself when you had narrow majorities. So it's part of the legislative process. We'll continue to work it. But
I never said the defense appropriations bill was trivial. I said the defense appropriation bill was bloated and filled with the kitchen sink of agriculture wars. And on the second bill, the LNG bill, I said it was repetitive because we've passed it twice already. It's going nowhere. We're going to pass it a third time, and that's going nowhere. At a time when our government's about to shut down, I mean, to take up a bill that is repetitive, that's going nowhere, seems like not a good use of our time. I did say that the non-binding resolution on guns was trivial because it doesn't do a damn thing. And we're living in a country where we have massacres occur on a regular basis, and we can't get any legislation to the floor, and the only bill we get to the floor on guns is a non-binding resolution that does nothing, that doesn't even go anywhere. It can't go to the Senate, doesn't go to the President. So I just want to be clear on what I said, because I think it is important. I do believe that this bill, this non-binding resolution, is an example of how trivial issues get debated passionately here, and important ones not at all.
The important point, which my friend makes and I agree with, shutting down the government is bad for the American people. It's an abdication of our responsibility. It's something we should not do. I've never supported them in the past. I hope we manage to avoid one now. I think that's exactly in what the Speaker is engaged in trying to accomplish, whether my friends agree with his methods or not. I will tell you I am mystified by this concern about the agreement, quote unquote. Again, we agreed on the top line numbers. We didn't say we're going to the top line numbers. This is the top line number. If we can do it for less and persuade the Senate that that's a good idea, then I don't see that as a bad thing. But if my friends are concerned about keeping agreements, maybe they ought to call over to their friends in the United States Senate who are producing bill after bill that are above these numbers. Guess what? I suspect each side is positioning for a negotiation, and magically we probably won't be too far off if we come to an agreement of the numbers that are laid out in the debt ceiling deal. So I'm not telling you this is the most efficient way to legislate, but I've seen it before, and we're seeing it from both sides right now. In terms of the budget, I tell you what, I'm interested in the opinions my friends have on the budget because they didn't bother to do one for the 4 years they were in the majority. So I'm thrilled they're actually marking up a budget in the Budget Committee. And I give Chairman Arrington a lot of credit for doing it. It's hard to do. My friends didn't do it for 4 years because they couldn't do it, because they couldn't come to an agreement. As a matter of fact, I remember those 4 years. I used to serve on the Budget Committee. You couldn't get a Budget Committee or budget out of the Budget Committee that you controlled. So you want to talk about dysfunction? And that Budget Committee sets the top line number for all spending. Maybe that's why we overspent so much. Matter of fact, you deemed budgets in the rule. So I would agree with you. We should probably be sitting down and figuring out ways to run our fiscal affairs better, and particularly to do it in a more cooperative way because, as my friends point out, you do control the United States Senate, you do control the United States presidency. But please don't lecture me on how you do budgets when you had the House, the Senate, and the presidency and could not write a budget in 4 years and get it out of your own committee, let alone bring it to this floor. And some of those years you weren't operating with a 5-seat majority. You just couldn't get the job done. So we're trying. I commend the Budget Committee. I hope they bring one out here. I'll be disappointed if they don't, but at least they're making the effort. Finally, again, to my friends, I can't figure out whether you want the Speaker to succeed or not, because there's lots of expression. Oh, I feel sorry for him in the job he has. Don't worry, he likes the job he has. He works hard at it every day. I think he's a good Speaker. He delivered on a debt ceiling deal that my friends even in the end came around and voted for, and he delivered one that was a heck of a lot better because it had some genuine concessions in it in terms of energy production, in terms of setting top lines. So we're on the eve of another kind of negotiation, and maybe we can find common ground again. I genuinely, quite frankly, hope that we do. And in that process, there'll be plenty of people on both sides of the aisle that don't like what the end product is, and they'll vote accordingly, and that's fair enough. But this is just kind of the way it works around here right now, and I think the Speaker's doing a terrific job trying to work the process, trying to make sure legislation moves across the floor in regular order, and trying to, get to numbers that begin to bring down this horrific deficit that my friends left the country with no plan to deal with it. No plan.
Look, the concern we have over here on this side of the aisle is that there are members on the Republican side who seem to be cheering on a shutdown. The other day, in an interview with PBS NewsHour, a fellow colleague on the Rules Committee, Mr. Norman of South Carolina, was asked how likely a shutdown is. And his response was, it's 100%. And then, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record a Truth Social post from yesterday by Donald Trump opposing the GOP's continuing resolution. I mean, the twice impeached, 4 times indicted former president is weighing in on the funding fights within his party, and ultimately he is endorsing actions that will shut down the government. And I have a strange feeling my Republican counterparts will gladly comply at the expense of the American people, because everybody on that side of the aisle is so frightened of him. The gentleman from Oklahoma was talking about a shutdown in 2018. I don't disagree with my friend that there was a brief shutdown in early 2018, one that a lot of people don't remember because it was so short. But of course, Republicans were I should point out that Republicans were in charge of the House and in charge of the Senate at the time. But I know some Democrats were pushing to help Dreamers as part of a funding deal. But that brief symbolic shutdown lasted less than 72 hours, most of it over the weekend, and if I remember correctly, it had no lasting impact. Now compare that to the 5-week Republican shutdown in 2018, which reduced economic output by $11 billion in the following 2 quarters, including $3 billion that the United States economy never regained. And that was a partial shutdown. And then the 2013 full Republican shutdown reduced GDP growth by $20 billion, according to Moody's Analytics. $20 billion. So I think it's a little more than unfair to play the both sides card here, because it doesn't apply. Mr. Speaker, Republicans claim that they're trying to save money, but continually weaken the United States government's creditworthiness at a cost to the United States taxpayers. In August, Fitch cited a decline in governance as a key reason for the United States downgrade, due to repeated battles over the past 2 decades that have led to government shutdowns or even taken the government to the brink of a debt default. Republicans need to get serious about governing and protect the United States' creditworthiness. And I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record an article from the AP entitled, "The U.S. Government's Credit Has Been Downgraded."
Without objection.
There are consequences to these games that people on the right are playing. And the consequences are detrimental to our economy, which in turn are detrimental to the American people.